Hello and welcome back to the Alnwick Castle Podcast. I'm Deborah Beecroft.
And I'm Daniel Watkins.
And on today's episode, we are joined by Iain Wheeldon, Senior Lecturer from the School of Arts and Cultures at Newcastle University.
As well as teaching subjects such as communication and learning in museums, galleries and heritage, and working closely with postgraduate students at the university, Iain runs the Cultural Peeps Careers Pathway podcast projects, which aim to help make sense of the different career pathways that can be taken in arts and culture.
Daniel spoke to Iain about the project, his own background, and what makes heritage sites like Alnwick Castle so engaging for so many people.
Here's that conversation. Please enjoy. We are very happy to be joined on this episode of the Alnwick Castle Podcast by Iain Wheeldon from Newcastle University. How are you today, Iain?
I'm very well, thank you.
Let's start with a little bit about you. So what's your background? What do you do at Newcastle Uni?
Okay, well, first of all, thanks for having me on the podcast. It's a real pleasure to be here. So, as he said, my name's Iain Wheeldon. I'm a senior lecturer at Newcastle University, and I teach primarily in the School of Arts and Cultures in a department called Media, Culture and Heritage. And I teach mainly across three programmes, and they relate to heritage, museum and galleries. So the three programmes are museum studies, curating art and global heritage management.
Global heritage, so you've got quite a wide scope of all sorts of different cultures then?
Yeah, so that's a programme which has relaunched this year. So it was previously called Heritage Studies, and we're responding to some quite significant changes that are happening around the world and in that particular area. So it's a slight change of focus for that. So we're kind of looking at a wider picture now on that programme.
Museums, galleries, heritage, they're things that a lot of people feel don't change, but actually behind the scenes things are changing all the time, even in places like castles that have stood for a huge amount of time. What's actually happening does evolve, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are, in this country, there are certain, I guess, consistent issues that are facing the sector, or I'm saying sector there, and I'm kind of putting all three together, and I might at some points call them sectors and separate them out, because there are some unique challenges with each of them. But I think that an ongoing issue, particularly in this country, is about money, and it's about kind of how you keep things going. I think we've had particular challenges in that area over the last 13 years or so. It's quite interesting on that front. I was looking at a report from about 20 years ago, a bit more than that, about 20 years ago, which was talking about what it would take to get the cultural sector kind of up off its knees, which was something that was commissioned by the then government. I think it's 2001. And it's remarkable how many of those issues have returned. And, I think that there's massive challenges happening there, particularly around cost of living, things that are happening at the moment. So we tend to work in buildings that are really not very energy efficient, particularly old buildings or converted buildings or whatever that might be, and that's a major challenge. I think the other thing that's happening, and we talked about it just before, is the echo of COVID. I think the recovery issue around COVID is something that's hugely impacted and continuing to impact the sector. On multiple fronts, I think that there are still markets missing from the tourism element, China, for example. And I think there's also echoes there in terms of recruitment in certain areas. So a lot of venues that I talk to and have spoken to through some of the work that I do, some of the research that I'm doing, have talked about issues that relate to recruitment around the hospitality side of it, which is a major income generation for a lot of cultural venues. Other things that are happening in the sector, I think that there's some really positive moves happening in the inclusivity and diversity areas. So trying to broaden out both the relevance of particular venues and looking at how they serve their communities, but also looking at who works in them, whose stories they're telling, and who represents those in terms of boards and trustees and all of those kinds of things. I think linked to that in some ways, decolonisation is quite an interesting and much needed area of work that's happening. I think that there's high profile bits of decolonisation happening, certainly around the kind of idea that or the arguments about whether we should be repatriating objects to original countries of origin with dubious provenance. But there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes which is looking at changing policy and structure and thinking quite laterally about how different communities are represented there within the structures. So I think the other area of work that's really interesting is around climate, not just in terms of how buildings can become more energy efficient or organisations can become more responsible or carbon neutral, but also what kinds of roles these organisations should take in that broader dialogue, across society.
These are all big issues that affect all different areas of society, and they're all reflected in these great places that people go to visit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
You've spoken to people from across the sector for your podcast, Cultural Peeps. So could you tell us a little bit about that and the project behind it?
Cultural Peeps is an ongoing podcast series which looks at the career decisions that individuals make as they're working within our sector. And that really comes from some work that I did as a lecturer at university. So for 17 years, I looked after, I'm not currently looking after, but I looked after placements and that kind of vocational element of our programs in terms of towards the end of the programs, trying to provide students with the opportunity to get out into the workplace and get some kind of real-world experience that helps them to contextualise some of the other work that we've done on the programme. And through that, we have conversations very early in the programme with them about what it is that they want to do. And because we're speaking to them quite early on in their journey, there is a limited vocabulary, which isn't necessarily their fault, and maybe we'll get on to why that's the case a little bit later on. But it's both a slightly frustrating thing if you're organising placements, because probably about 80-90% of the students will come in and you say, what do you think you want to do? And they will say, I want to be a curator, because that's the word that they tend to understand as being central to cultural sector work. Whereas when you actually drill down into that, they want to do something that's quite different. And plus the word curator means loads of different things depending on where you work and in what context you work. So being a curator in English heritage is totally different from being a contemporary art curator. So I talked to the students about how we could help them to think about their vocabulary around job titles and what we could do to support them. And one of the things that they came back with, which is both helpful from a student perspective and unhelpful from a kind of perspective of somebody that's trying to kind of think about ways of disseminating some of this information, is that they said, yeah, we want loads more information, but we don't want any more lectures and we don't do any more work that relates to this. So we just want it beamed into our brains in some way. So I went on holiday and kind of listened to a lot of podcasts and thought, this is a natural format for this. So what I embarked on really was a series of long-form conversations with people about how they got to where they are and what their jobs look and feel like on a day-to-day basis. So it's about kind of exploring what it's like to work in particular venues, what it is that they value, which I think is a tremendously important part of why people work in this sector, and kind of how they got there. Because I think that sometimes, the students say to me that when somebody comes in to speak to them, they often put a slide up that has a list of jobs, and then it looks like they've had some kind of well thought out magical career path that's moved them through it, whereas really there's probably something messy and knotty and, I had kids and I wanted to move here, or, whatever it is, or had to care for parents, and there's normally a human element to all of that, which I think sometimes gets a little bit disregarded. So we recorded the first set of recordings was 20 recordings, and they went out in 2019, and then there was a second set which was due to go out around Easter 2020, which got parked due to the COVID pandemic. And then we've started again, so there's another 20 episodes that will be out before the end of the year. They look at everything really from heritage, museums, galleries, but I've also expanded that slightly this year to look at some of the more theatre-based careers, because they are starting to cross over. Those kind of professionals are crossing over into heritage quite a lot now.
a crossover between theatre and heritage.
Yeah, so I think there's been a kind of rise in that kind of experiential offer in certain types of heritage sites. So, certainly towards the end of last year, I kind of visited quite a few sites where they were working with theatre companies to put on kind of more experiential, and there might be one-off kind of activities. It might last a few weeks, but you would go in and have quite a different experience on the site to the one that you would normally have.
Here in the northeast, Newcastle Uni, we're at Alnwick. Castles are a big part of the heritage of the region. For the northeast, how important do you think places like Alnwick castles are to creating those experiences for people and finding that way in to the sector?
Yeah, I think castles are a big part of Northumberland's offer. So I think in terms of tourism, they're really at the forefront of that offer. It's kind of castles and coastlines are the two big things there. And I think certainly from a tourism perspective, it's a way of kind of, I guess, drawing tourists in, which feeds into the local economy. But it's also given a reason for tourists to stop where they're on the way to maybe Edinburgh if they're staying in London or wherever it might be. We have a huge number of castles here, which is great for our programme because we use lots of them, in terms of our teaching, and it means that we can get out there and kind of visit those sites. I think that in terms of identity, it's a more complicated issue. I'd be interested to know what you think of this, actually, but I think it's a more complicated issue because it's one of those things that I think when people come to visit, let's go and take them to some castles, and then people's relationships with castles are sometimes a bit more complicated. So I don't know whether that rings true for you there.
I have never lived anywhere that didn't have a castle. So for me, they've always just been part of the background. Yeah. And I think a lot of people living in Northumberland, you have a castle in the town or the village where you live, but you don't necessarily think about it that much. It's just there, and it's just always been there. They're just part of.
It's an interesting thing, that, isn't it? Because it's both an integral part of an identity of the region, but then when it comes to that individual identity, I think it's much more complicated.
But yeah, everybody who works here and is involved with it is really proud of it and wants to tell everybody else about it. But if you are just living across the street from it, it's like next door.
Yeah.
It just happens to be a 1,000-year-old castle. And when you say that to people from America or Australia who don't have castles everywhere, it reminds you how special and significant these places can be.
It's an interesting thing. I think that we have quite an unusual relationship with our history and heritage in this country. We don't necessarily use it to confront our future in a way that a lot of other countries do. So I think that we use it as a hobby a lot of the time. I think that's quite a complicated thing. So it's something that we decide to engage with rather than allow it to represent us in a particular way.
It is just part of life, and you almost don't think about the history behind it. It's just always been there.
I think that's the case in a lot of those towns across Northumberland. I mean, you'll always get a hardcore of people who are really interested in that local history element, but I think for a lot of other people, the identity is quite a fluid thing in terms of how it feeds into their identity. It's quite a fluid thing.
It does work as a representation. Everybody who works here, particularly if they have friends or family coming to visit,
always bring them.
They always bring them. We all want to show off the castle.
It's a really odd thing, isn't it? It's a real sense of pride. There are different reasons that people visit these kind of sites as well, aren't there? There are some people who you say castle to and they immediately think, depending on which generation they are, they might think Frozen or Cinderella or Game of Thrones or whatever. And other people think romantic, Turner-esque, shrouded in clouds. Other people are interested in the architecture of it or the actual history, or it might be that they're interested in the technological advancements that came. But there are so many different motivations for engagement there that it's quite difficult to pin it down.
Alnwick Castle's lucky to have so many different parts of that history because it's always evolved over time. It hasn't stayed as a ruin.
Yeah.
But we've been talking about history quite a lot, and you were talking about heritage quite a lot as well. And the difference between the two is probably another complicated thing. Where does history stop and heritage start? Are they the same thing?
Crikey, that's a big question. But I think history arguably is a a study of the past. So, it's kind of what happened, and with that comes multiple perspectives, and every story has its own perspective that's attached to that. And you can separate that down in whatever ways you might want to make it more manageable, whether it's geographical or political or economic or social, whatever, environmental. And heritage is a more... Well, heritage, I think it has more of a relationship with the material that's left behind and the culture that's left behind. So you can split that down again into, very crudely, I'll maybe split it down here into cultural property. So you're thinking about buildings or objects that might make up a museum collection, or that represent something from the past, or we're in this room, piece of furniture or whatever it might be. You have intangible heritage, which is more about language or customs or traditions that exist there. There's the landscape, the heritage of the landscape, which in some cases has been dramatically altered or changed by humans, and there are obviously environmental issues there. And then you have digital heritage, which I think then, this is where it starts to overlap back into cultural property in some ways, because I think that there are digital spaces where some of the conversations happen that almost feel like new town halls or whatever, but they're all existing online. So there are differences between history and heritage, and I think that certainly within academia they're kind of broken down into those, but I kind of often wonder how much the general public really make a distinction between those. They kind of, your average visitor that comes here probably won't make that distinction between history and heritage.
But for somebody who's working, creating these things, it's good to have.
Yeah, I think understanding what the parameters of those are, or kind of what area you're interested in is certainly important. So it might be that you specialise in a particular area of heritage, or it might be that you specialise in a particular area of cultural property, whether could work for English heritage and be a properties curator and deal with the fabric of building all day, every day. Or it might be that you work in an archive and you're dealing with paper or whatever it might be. So there's subsets of skills that are attached to each of those different kind of career interests or career paths.
And you've spoken to people from across all these different career interests. Have you found over 40 episodes that there's a lot that people have in common about what they love about working in these sectors, or have people got in and out of it for completely different reasons?
There are some similarities that fall not across all of the interviews, but are certainly there across a lot of them. I would say that the thing that is apparent from an interviewer's perspective on this is that these kinds of careers are almost invisible, certainly at primary, secondary age. It's not until either late A-level or university degree that this becomes a kind of viable, I could actually do this. And I think that goes back to that kind of idea of heritage or history as a hobby. It's not a kind of potential serious career in some way, and I don't think that's helped by the way that some of the conversations might be set up politically around that. But that's something that's really apparent. So people tend to love history as a subject at school. They loved going to places. They have really vivid memories of this particular visit to a place that really sparked their imagination. And then it kind of disappears off, and there's not much there until somebody kind of plugs a later interest back into that and says, well, actually, these two things fit together, and this is a potential career path there. So that's something that's definitely present in the interviews. I think there is a commonality as well between people figuring out what their values are. So I think that a lot of people that work within the cultural sector, and that's more broadly within the cultural sector, have worked out really what they stand for and what they want to contribute. So whether that's some kind of improvement in terms of society, or trying to help people to understand the world that they live in, so that they're offering a particular type of skill set there to a venue. I think that there is a thing as well about kind of gravitating towards being in a gang, and that's a kind of group of like-minded people that all work in venues together. So some of the people that I've interviewed talk about having worked in more commercial sectors or explicitly profit-driven sectors and feeling very uncomfortable, and have gravitated towards back to either further education to get to retrain, or that they've kind of found a way into the cultural sector there through that path. So that there are some commonalities there. There are certainly some similarities in terms of the difficulty of getting into the sector that exists there, particularly around the need for experience for entry-level jobs, which has created, I think, problems in terms of inclusivity and led to a lack of diversity within the sector, because you have to have a particular set of resources available to you to be able to volunteer. So I think that there's some kind of commonality there. Being able to open resources to people that encourage discussion and debate and that feed into those kinds of ideas of identity. So how did we get here, and what does it mean to be, us, and what does the future look like? I think that there is a value that a lot of the participants in the podcast see there. So it's about trying to encourage debate and thinking about, well, how can we keep this debate going that will help inform, future generations?
So after studying this, after going on their placements, after listening to this podcast, do you find that vocabulary you mentioned before is broadened out, and it's more than just being a curator when you're part of heritage, when you're part of a museum, when you're part of a castle?
In some ways, I think that the podcast has helped with that. I think it's had some unexpected knock-on effects. So we made it available to the general public. So it's out there on Spotify or Apple or whatever platform that you would listen to your podcast on. It's kind of available everywhere. And I wanted to do that because I think that there are conversations that happen behind closed doors that most early career professionals want to hear or engage with for a number of reasons. I think that people, it makes people feel slightly better that other people haven't got these immaculate career structures that, have just happened to them, that there's always some kind of tangled knot there. I still think we still have an issue with that vocabulary, but I think it's about trying to get the students and early career professionals to think about the range of different job opportunities out there, because there are a huge number of potential pathways that you can take. You could be doing something extremely specialist around co-production or co-curation, and that would have its own job title, or you might be a kind of programmer which has a curatorial element. And on the other hand, you might be working in learning and doing really interesting work there. And sometimes all of these things cross over. So I'm not sure it's solved any problems in that sense, but the idea is that it's a lasting resource that people will be able to tap into. My only issue, I think, with it is that people tend to just listen to the episodes where they can identify with the job title, which is kind of doesn't solve the problem, if you see what I mean.
I am one of these episodes.
You are one of you are indeed.
Yeah. So what was the impact of Cultural Peeps? What's the legacy that you found it's had?
So we made the podcast available on as many platforms as we could. So it's out there publicly. It wasn't just a resource that's for our students, because I thought there was a value for early career professionals. So we can track the statistics there and kind of figure out kind of where people are listening to that. And we can see that that's popping up at different universities, which is really encouraging because it's an open resource. And the idea is that it's a bank of interviews which you can continually go back to. You can dip in and out of. You don't necessarily have to listen to all of them. So it's not a sequential series. So the idea is that you can listen to the stories of somebody that you might know, you might admire, or it might be that you don't know anything about, but you look at the job title and think, that's interesting, how do I get into that? So I think that in that sense, it's out there and is a continually available resource, which that was the goal, and it will continue to grow. And I'm hoping that over time, and as the sector changes, this will become a little document about what the sector felt like at this particular time. So it's a resource that's there and out there, and hopefully will continue to be used by not just students, but by everybody.
Where can people go if they want to find out more about it, or if they want to look into studying heritage? And some of these programs sound like something that people think, actually, that's what I want to do. Where would you direct them?
Yeah, so for the podcast, as I said, you can listen to the podcast on pretty much any platform. So you should just be able to search for the podcast, or you can go to the source page, which is a Soundcloud page. Just Google Cultural Peeps and it will take you there. And then there are also links through the various social media platforms as well. So you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and LinkedIn. I think LinkedIn's probably the best place for some of these career conversations if people are interested in engaging with that stuff at the moment. And then in terms of the programs that we run at the university, so there's 3 programs. So there's museum studies, curating art and global heritage management. And you can find those on the university webpage, that's Newcastle University, and they're postgraduate programs. Or alternatively, you can message me and I will answer any questions. I'm the admissions officer for those programs, so I'm more than happy to field questions. So you can either find my email address through the university website or you can direct message me through Twitter.
Excellent. Well, that probably brings us to a conclusion. So I will say thank you very much for joining us on the Alnwick Castle podcast, and good luck with the future of Cultural Peeps.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
To find out more about the Cultural Peeps Careers Pathway project, please visit soundcloud.com/culturalpeeps or culturalpeeps.wordpress.com.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Alnwick Castle Podcast, please subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Share it with your friends and let us know what you think by emailing podcast@alnwickcastle.com.
We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. Until then, I've been Daniel.
And I've been Deborah.
Thank you very much for listening and goodbye.
Bye.